One of the easiest openings to learn in modern chess theory for white is the king's Indian attack. Now, what makes it so easy to learn? There are no forced variations, and there is one general plan that goes throughout the most of this opening. Well, only very seldom when black chooses some unorthodox way of developing in the early stage, white has to vary and be flexible as well. That's very well based on positional principles and very solid opening that you start in a slow, that develops in a slow phase, and white has a good chance of getting very strong and powerful attack. Well, just to mention, this opening was adapted by some of world's top players in the world. By Michael Tal played it, Bobby Fischer played it, David Bronstein played it, and they had some very good, great results. Well, I'm not putting myself on their level, but I was very big fan of it, and I played myself this opening also very well. I wouldn't play if I didn't believe strong, and every opening I do suggest, I believe deeply in it. So get comfortable and learn one of the easiest openings that you can adapt within days. King's Indian attack, one of the easiest opening to get. Even if you play e4, which looks like you're going to play some other opening, Ruy Lopez, a 2 knights defense, and after e6, if you can go d3 followed by knight d2, knight f3, g3 and bishop g2, you're most likely going to get King's Indian attack. Or you can start with e4 if they play c5 against you. Again, you can go d3, knight d2, knight f3, g3. This is probably the easiest opening to get in whole opening encyclopedia. So you don't have to start with e4. You can go with knight f3, which is probably the most popular way to play to get the King's Indian attack, and then you go g3, bishop g2, just like you play King's Indian for black with knight f6, g6, bishop g7, only you do it with an extra tempo. So let's look at some critical positions of King's Indian attack. So if we go knight f3, and your opponent goes d5, g3, and they may go like c5, bishop g2, knight f6, castle, and knight c6. Now, here is the position that we can go d4 or c4, but we are not going to discuss this because those are completely different openings. So we are concentrating only on d3. Now, if black plays e5, we have 100% transposition to the King's Indian opening, King's Indian defense, with reversed colors, where white now has an extra tempo. There are interesting ways white can use this extra tempo for developing an initiative. One of the ways is c4. That's an interesting move. Now, black has, I think, three reasonable choices, to go d4, to go bishop e7, or to play d takes c. Now, if black plays d takes c, the best answer for white is to go queen a4, and now we have transposition to some other opening, which is kind of a Maroczy bind with black played bishop d7, and now black has to do something against white's threat knight takes e5,
They can of course go bishop to d6, but we're still gonna play queen takes c4, and if black castles, this is for players who like those type of positions. This is for players who play King's Indian attack and who may go bishop g5 here, the accelerated dragon. So they can go bishop g5, knight c3, and they have reasonably good, comfortable game. Now, let's look at couple of other continuations. Couple of other continuations here after c4 are d4, and then what we should do here, we may go e3, and after bishop e7 we may go e takes d, and if e takes d then rook e1, and if c takes d, here white is simply gonna have a good position even after playing b4. That's an interesting move. It's a strictly tactical shot because black did not castle on bishop takes b4. Notice that knight takes b4 simply is not good because white takes central. Pawn on e5, and if bishop takes b4, then we have very simple combination: knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and queen a4 check, winning the bishop on b4, and white is going to have very good position. For example, on bishop d7, queen takes b4. Well, not to mention that white also has the option of playing in this position. For example, knight takes e5. Well, after b4, knight takes b4, knight takes e5, or bishop takes b4, knight takes e5. In both cases, white has certain initiative. Well, let's look at this continuation. Queen a4, and on bishop d7, queen takes b4. And if black tries to win this pawn, now they are a pawn up. But that's not recommended way to play for black, because first of all, white can play queen takes b7, which is very good, and get their pawn back, or white can play simply queen a3, and black has difficulties castling, and pawn on b7 is hanging. White is doing very well. So those are like briefly couple of variations I just showed you that may occur if if black tries to play like a regular King's Indian, if black tries to play like white in King's Indian attack. So most likely when you play knight f3 and knight f6, very popular for black after g3, is d5 continuation. And when we go bishop g2, bishop f5, castle, and then c6. Now this is known as very solid continuation for black, and this is known like as white has no advantage here. I will dispute it. I agree that white does not have a big advantage, but I think white has a couple of interesting ways to get some initiative. For example, d3, or even c4, e6, c takes d, e takes d. Now, if we go knight c3 and after bishop e7, d3, what can happen here is that after castle, we can go queen c2 or even rook e1, or maybe even knight d4, and on bishop g6, e4. Now, those are very interesting. This is very interesting continuation for white, and I think white can fight for an opening advantage here. The other continuations may be like rook e1, bishop f4, and also for e4. since white has, in a way, kind of an extra pawn in its center, they may have to try to take advantage of it. Well, those are all possible continuations. Also, for those who like slow maneuvering game, I may recommend after knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, and bishop f5, I may recommend direct game to a very slow pace. D3, h6, preparing bishop h7. Now you can go b3, and after c6, bishop b2, and on bishop e7, knight d2. And when black castles, you go c4. Now this is going to be a very positional maneuvering game. If black goes knight d7, we can go rook c1, then we can go queen c2, and eventually going to go a3, maybe b4, maybe knight d4 and e4, or maybe e4 right away. So this is, we cannot really analyze this position, because unlike any other opening that I have covered on DVDs, this opening, all I can show you here are the plans that white have and plans that black may have. So this position we just looked is approximately equal. I think white has tiny bit of initiative. Now let's go with knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6, castling, bishop e7, d3, castled, and this position probably is the most common way to play for black against King's Indian attack. And why? Because you're not going to get this position with this exact same move order. But this is common. Let me explain why. This position itself is common because this position you may get from French defense when you go knight f3 or d3, d5, knight d2, knight f6, g3, and that's how you get it from French defense, because eventually when the position will look, you're going to go e4. And this also, this exact same position, you can easily picture that you can get also from the Sicilian defense. e4, c5, and then you go d3, and you're going to get the same position. So let's look at this position closely. There are some fine points how to play these positions, and I will try to explain it, and I will try to lay all this position out. e4, c5, let's randomly, we take it in this order: knight f3, e6, d3, d5, knight d2, knight c6 or knight f6, it doesn't make difference, g3, now maybe knight f6, bishop g2, and after bishop e7, castle and castle. This is one way. This is one way to play this position. Of course, there are some other ways like playing b6 also for black, but let's get the most common, the most primitive way to play for black, and let's see what we can do here. Okay, what we can do here, we're going to have to close this position with e5 center. Well, you can do e5 right away, or you can do rook e1. I don't think it's going to change much. e5, knight d7, rook e1, and if black attacks queen c7, you go queen e2. Now our e5 pawn is secure, it's protected, and black can't attack e5 pawn anymore. White is going to pursue with its plan, unless black wants to go f6, but that's attacking this pawn, but on the other hand, this pawn is going to be exchanged. Now black takes with a knight. Now this position, I think, is clearly better for white. There are several ways to play. The way I like to play is knight f1 followed by bishop f4. And if black goes bishop d6, then we can go maybe h4 on bishop h3, maybe h4 and knight h2, trying to get knight to g4, because any time black goes e5 here, after knight g5, or even bishop g5, followed by c4, you see, white is going to put some pressure on black's d5 pawn, maybe even by playing knight e3. And if black pushes that pawn, that creates a lot of weaknesses on c4 square and e4 square for white's pieces. This is simple strategy and on a weak squares. So this position I like for white very much. Now let's look what will happen if black does not try to play f6. If black doesn't play f6, then obviously they should try to create some play on the queen side. Suppose they go b5 and start the pawn storm on queen side. Then we're going to go knight f1. So our knight heading towards the king side. Black goes a5, we will go h4. Now suppose black goes bishop b7, we can go bishop f4. We're just concluding development. Black goes b4, we go knight h2, black goes a4. Now this position was played by Fischer. Fischer actually played several times and won some very nice games playing the King's Indian attack. The correct way, how should white pursue attack? What is the plan? How do you go with this attack? Okay, the way to attack black in this position is knight g5. This is the most active way. What you want to do, you want black to play h6. Once black plays h6, even if you retreat the knight to f3, black has serious weakness on h6 because white may go knight g4 and later on sacrifice on h6, or maybe even play g4 and g5, opening some files, or maybe h5 followed by g5, opening some files on a king side. After knight g5, if black takes the knight, then we will take with h, and now this position is really bad for black. Actually, I should say this position is lost. Because what white can do is go knight g4, pawn on g5 is very strong, bishop f3. Of course, we have to watch out for knight d4 move. Maybe even we can go knight g4 and knight f6 check right away. Or we can go knight g4, bishop f3. If knight is not on c6, if knight is on c6, we can always exchange that and go c3. Somehow you have to stop knight d4. When after you go bishop f3 and king g2, bringing rook on h1 and using h-file will be absolutely deadly for black. Let's go again. So now I want to get through this variation. I want to go through this variation once more because it's important. Once you get position, you will get good position. But then good position may quickly turn to a bad position if you don't choose the right plan. So g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castle, castle, e5, and here, and now after knight d7, rook e1, our plan is to go h4, knight f1, knight h2, and then protect the e5 pawn and go knight g5, queen h5, creating threats to black's king. Now this is very easy plan, and the good thing about this plan that you don't have to learn too many variations. So this is perfectly okay for white, obviously. Now let's look at some other continuations. And before we look at them, what I want to tell you is this. When we play knight f3, g3, d3, bishop g2, and castle, e4 is the move that designs King's Indian attack. In one case, when we play c4 instead of e4, it's if black plays c5, d5, and e5, as I already showed in earlier example. For instance, knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, c5, castle, knight c6, d3, e5. That's the only case. It's not that we cannot play e4. We can still go e4 right away even. But c4 I recommend more only in this case. Only in this case when white played c5, d5, and e5. So then I recommend c4 with the variations analyzed earlier. Okay, now we will go to some positions that may occur because black has, when we play knight f3, knight f6, g3, and you know that you want to go bishop g2 and castle, black, we have to realize that we give black wide wide opportunities. So we give them a lot of choices to pick from how to set up. For instance, they can go b6 and on bishop g2, bishop b7. Now, is this a King's Indian attack? Yes. We're gonna castle anyway, and if black goes e6 or whatever they do, we stick to our plan. We go d3. Now, if they go d5, we can go knight d2 followed by e4, and on bishop e7 even we still can go e4. And if black takes here, we have two interesting continuations. First of all, not a bad idea to play d takes e, and after knight takes e4, knight e5 is creating a lot of problems for black. And the other move here for white after d takes e is knight g5, and later taking on e4 with the g knight. So you don't have to worry about black stopping you from playing e4. e4 you can play no matter what black does. Now let's look at a couple of other setups for black. Again, knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, and suppose they go here g6. And after we castle, bishop g7, d3, and castle. We have now typical King's Indian position with reversed colors and extra tempo for white. Now, when you get frequently in chess, you get certain opening with reversed colors, and normally when it's reversed colors, white has an extra tempo. And what is the best way to take advantage of this extra tempo? In this position, you can go normally knight d2 and e4, which will clearly give you very easy game. in knight d2, for example, c5, e4, and after knight c6, rook e1, that will give you okay position. Now, we cannot go through all the variations. What you do, the best thing to guide yourself through this opening is to take a regular King's Indian position with this variation in reversed colors, and you see how game goes, and then realize that you have an extra tempo. So what can you do for this extra tempo? For instance, if black goes e5, you can go c3, and after rook e8, you can play e takes d, knight takes d5, knight c4, creating certain pressure on e5 pawn, and well, extra tempo will be very, very useful here. But for that, you have to go through some variations of the regular King's Indian defense. Well, this is King's Indian attack, which means we're going to have an extra tempo when we play white. Let's move on about options for black. Again, knight f3, and after knight f6, g3. Suppose black goes c5 and never goes d5, bishop g2, knight c6, we castle, and suppose they go g6. We go d3, bishop g7. Now it's clear what black wants. Black wants to castle and go d6. So we will go e4, and on castling we will go rook e1, and after d6 I would recommend to play c3 with the idea of d4. That should give you some advantage. Move like bishop g4, you can simply go h3. White cannot stop, black cannot stop white from playing d4. So if bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and now knight d7, you can go bishop e3. So now it's only a matter of time when you will go d4, knight d2, maybe knight c4, maybe d4 right away. So white is doing real well in this position. So you have one universal setup, which is knight f3. What you need to know is that's what you get almost no matter what black does. You get this setup and you go e4. Now what I want to do now is just show you for those people who play e4 and after c5, knight f3, e6, if they want to transpose from e4 move to the King's Indian attack. Now this is very, very interesting position. It has some subtleties. We'll have some additional options for white. For example, we can go d3, black goes d5, and here instead of playing regular knight d2, knight d2 is a normal move. That's what we would normally play. But here, since you didn't play knight d2 earlier, you have an option to play queen to e2. Now, why is it so different? What difference does it make? If black takes, white takes, just remember, this setup, this pawn structure, almost always favors white. And the reason why, here, white controls more squares in the center, and white has space advantage. Once you go g3, bishop g2, and castle, you're going to have very easy game. c3, knight d2, and knight c4. Black is going to have certain problems placing pieces in active positions. So now let's go back and let's look what is so different. What is so different about move queen e2? Again, e4, c5, knight f3, e6. We go d3, d5, queen e2. Suppose black does all the things they did before anyway. Knight c6, we go g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, we castle, and black castles. Now here is what's different here. We have knight on b1. Now if we go knight d2, we will get the same position we get in regular King's Indian attack. But here we have additional option, and this option is e5. When black goes knight d7, now you can go c4, and that's the additional option. You can go c4. Now, couldn't you go c4 with a knight on d2? Yes, you could, but it doesn't have the same effect, because now what you want to do, if black goes queen c7, well, no, first of all, we have to protect the e5 pawn. We will rook e1, for example, and on move like b6, on something like b6, you will go knight c3, maybe even cd, ed, and now knight c3. Black has serious problems. You see, knight on c3 is putting pressure on d5 pawn, and that's why we play c4. But c4 with a knight on d2 does not have the same effect, because we can't attack d5 pawn again. Now, but what would happen if black took on c4? Then we take back, and you see that we have knight c3 later, and knight e4, and maybe even knight b5 and knight d6. You see, and after bishop f4, white has very big advantage. But what would happen if black went d4? Then what will happen, that white will go bishop f4, and then knight d2, and white has outpost for knight, very knight square on e4, and black does not have any squares in the center. But again, I have to point that this may happen only, well, most likely to happen when you play e4 first move, and against French you go e6, for example. You can go d3, and under d5 even queen e2 right now. Well, then of course black can go knight c6, you will go c3, and then continue the same King's Indian setup. But normally they would go maybe like bishop e7, knight f3, knight f6, g3, and they will go c5. That's the most expected continuation. Bishop g2, and after castle, knight c6, e5, we got the setup we wanted. Knight is on b1, and we still have an option to go c4, and that gives us very good position. So for example, if black takes dc, goes knight d4, this is not going to be very good for them, because after knight takes, pawn takes. Now we're going to go rook d1, and d4 pawn is significant weakness. Now on something like knight c5, we can go knight d2, followed by knight e4, and the farther this pawn pushes, the more weakness and weaker it's going to become. No, then we're going to go knight e4, and if d3 pawn is not going to exist for much longer. So this is an interesting idea to delay knight d2 move and play c4 and knight c3. Okay, now let's look at some additional options and some active plans for black. If we go knight f3, those who wants to play knight f3, and you have to point, why should you go e4 or knight f3? If you ask this question, what's the easiest way, what's the better variation of a King's Indian attack we're gonna get? By going e4 first move, or the knight f3? That's impossible to answer because this all depends on what is your repertoire. For example, what you're going to play on e4, d5. You're not going to get King's Indian attack now. Now, do you like to play against it, or do you like to play against e5, or do you like to play against Sicilian, whatever variation, if after knight f3 black doesn't go e6 but goes knight c6? Well, all these questions you have to keep in mind before you choose your first move, even if you know you want to play King's Indian attack. Now, if we go knight f3, here is something we have to know. d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6, castle, bishop e7, d3, castle. We see now we're having problem playing e4, so we gotta play knight d2, and that's the difference. After knight c6, we are okay with playing e5. Now suppose white we're playing e5, but suppose black didn't castle, and now black's move. Suppose they go queen c7, and after rook e1 b6. Now what black wants, they may want to play bishop b7. The move I recommend here and the plan I recommend here, I do not recommend to play e5 unless black castled. Now I can show you briefly why is it. On e5, knight d7, queen e2, bishop b7. When you go knight f1, black will always have a very strong play with a g5 move. And you see, if you take on g5, you eventually gonna lose the e5 pawn. And black still has an option of castling queenside. So they may not even play g5 right away, but they may castle long first, and then they may go g5. So I will always try to avoid this continuation for black. So what I would like to do in this case, so here is the bullet point, very important. Do not play e5 unless black is already castled. Knight f3, knight f6, g3, d5, bishop g2, e6, castled, c5, d3, knight c6, knight d2, b6, e4, bishop b7. We go rook e1, and we make all the moves we expected to do. So now bishop e7. Here is white's move. You can make another move waiting queen e2, but I would take on d5. That's what I like. Now, black has two options to take, with a knight and with a pawn. I cannot tell you that white clearly has an advantage in both cases. No, white clearly has an easy game, an easy plan. After e takes d, what you should do is to play d4. Now this is very interesting move. If black takes cd, we're going to go knight b3. We're going to get the pawn on d4 back, and we're going to have better position. If black goes c4, then we're going to go c3, followed by knight e5, knight f3, with much better position. Maybe even instead of knight f3, maybe knight f1 is a better square to go to e3 and attack d5 later. But knight f3 is good enough. So that's what happens if black takes with a pawn. Now if black takes with a knight, knight takes d5, then we can go knight c4, black castles, we go a4, and this is some kind of a King's Indian setup where black will never be able to play e5. So we can go c3, queen c2, And then bishop d2, rook a d1, or maybe even knight e5. We have very comfortable position. This is comfortable position. I cannot tell you we have an advantage. Well, as another option to play for white, believe it or not, you can go d4 even now. And if black takes with a pawn, then you can go knight to b3. And later you recapture on d4 with a knight, and will also have very small but stable advantage. And if black takes with a knight, it's the same thing. We take on d4, pawn takes back on d4, we will go knight b3, and you see you have no problem recapturing the d4 pawn, having some advantage. Those are the choices white has if black tries to delay castling. Then we play e takes d in this position, and again summarizing quickly, on ed we go d4, and on knight takes d5 you have a choice, you have an option to play knight c4 and a4 for long positional game, or you can go d4 as well. That's comfortable position for very comfortable position for white. As of other setups, now what happens if black copies white's moves? Knight f3, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, castle, castle. Now, of course, we don't want to analyze c4 moves or d4 moves because they are okay, they are good moves, but this is not King's Indian attack. We go d3, and your opponent goes d6. What should we do here? Now here you have an option. c4. You can go c4 and play type of position for English type of position. If black goes e5, then you go knight c3, which I recommend, and I have actually widely analyzed it on one of my DVDs as well as in Encyclopedia series. This is one, and you can also play e4. Now, if black goes c5, then it will exactly transpose to one of the continuations we just analyzed a little while ago, rook e1, c3, and d4. And if black goes e5, now it's symmetrical. But we know that there is no symmetrical position, that there is, black can never copy all the way white's moves, because it's known, very well known, we don't want to go through this now, that it never ends up well for black. For now, black is okay, but we can go knight c3, and on knight c6 we can go either knight h4 or knight e1, trying for f4. That's an easy position to play. Again, I'm not vouching for serious advantage, but it's very comfortable position to play. You can go knight e1, you can go knight d2 and knight c4, followed by f4, and in both cases you are doing fine. And here you went through the opening, you have clear plan, you have good position, not necessarily with serious advantage, and you know what to do in a later stage of the game. You have an easy middle game. That's the dream of every chess player who is not very well equipped with opening theory knowledge. Now, when we go knight f3, the other thing black can do, suppose they want to play f5, and they want to play, suppose they want to play some kind of a Dutch defense. I want to give you a couple of suggestions. First of all, it's not bad to play e4 here. It's an interesting move, it's a little sharp, It has very little to do with King's Indian attack, but if black goes f5 move, it's okay to go e4, and on fe knight to g5, attacking the e4 pawn, and after knight f6, d3. It's very dangerous for black to accept this pawn sacrifice because bishop takes d3, and now white just has a threat of knight takes h7 followed by bishop g6 checkmate, and if e5, then I don't know, we may castle and go rook e1. This is very dangerous continuation for black to accept this pawn sack. So after e4, fe knight g5, black maybe should just go at knight f6 and on d3 e5. So then we play knight takes e4, and again we have comfortable position. But that's e4 may not be the best move, but it's very much playable. So, but we can go simply g3, knight f6, bishop g2, black goes e6, castle, and black goes bishop e7. Now we have King's Indian attack set up for white. Black has Dutch defense. Now what can we do here? Well, we can go d4 followed by c4 and transpose 100% to a Dutch opening, which is not the best opening black can play, and it's okay to do that. Also, we can go d3, and on castling, go knight c3. I wouldn't want to go knight d2 and then e4 because I don't want to block my bishop. I would go knight c3 followed by e4, and e4 is going to be on any move black chooses to play. Even if black chooses to play d5, we will go e4, and e4 is good here. F takes c, d takes c, and if d takes c, you're easily going to get this pawn back, and you will have better pawn structure, better piece development, and clear advantage. So that's the way I would recommend you to play if black plays Dutch defense. So on Dutch we go e4, d3 and e4. That's on setup with Dutch. Now there is a couple of positions I have to talk to you how to play. It's a little subtle positional play which you should know how to play. Knight f3, knight f6 position we're talking about. g3, d5, bishop g2, c5, castling, knight c6, d3, e6, knight d2, e4, bishop e7, rook e1, and here we looked at this position several times already. And black, suppose black plays d takes e, we go d takes e, and black stops us from playing e5, black goes e5. Now, what do we have here? Experienced player and strong player will know what to do with this position for white. Now, for those who is not on the level of master or higher, I want to give you a few pointers here how to play this position. Now let's talk about this position first before we figure out what the plan is going to be here. White plays c3, and therefore the white covers every square in its center. d4 square is not accessible for black knight, but d5 square will be accessible at some point to white knight. Now, second part, black has kind of a bad bishop on e7, dark square bishop. When white's light square bishop, that's a corresponding bishop, is not that bad, and black's dark square bishop is also good. Now, because black's square bishop, black's bishop, it does not have diagonal it can work on. White does. You see, after bishop f1, diagonal from f1 to a6, it's open. So what can we do? How can this position be played? After c3, castle, we take the queen out of the way. We go queen e2 or queen c2. Suppose if black wants to play bishop to e6, they have to play h6 first, because on bishop e6 we can go knight g5 and bishop has to go back. So suppose black goes h6, we can go knight c4 attacking the e5 pawn. Well, black has no problem defending it, and now we can go a4. Now we can go a4, and later on we can go knight e3 and try to put knight on d5. Or for this reason, maybe queen could have been better on e2. Or even if black plays bishop e6, we go queen e2 now, which is a loss of a tempo. I don't think it's critical in this type of positions, because pieces are not clashing here and tempo is less valuable. Our next plan will be knight h4, knight f5, and you see black, even though they have sufficient space to play on, they have no counterplay at all. Then we can go knight e3 and have a plan of going knight d5, maybe queen f3, maybe, well, how we support the knight on c4, by going bishop f1, queen f3, and creating some threats to h6 square and to black's king side. This position is always better for white, because white has a plan, clear plan. White has very strong outpost for knight on c4, and white has better chances on the king side. So this type of position will always favor white, this pawn structure. Looks like active for black, but in reality black will have no visible counterplay. Now again, knight f3, knight f6, g3. Now let's talk about this continuation, d5, and after bishop g2, not bishop f5 as we looked, but bishop to g4. On bishop g4 we can castle. Black goes knight d7, actually, knight d7, and they want to play e5. We go d3, we make all the standard moves typical for King's Indian attack, and now white goes e5. Now what do we do and how do we play this position? We will go knight d2, and we are planning on e4, bishop e7, or bishop d6, e4, and c6. This position is not bad for black, but I would rather be white in this position. So we can go rook e1, and a castle. We can go queen to e2, and then go knight f1 and knight e3. So suppose black goes queen c7, knight f1. You see, our plan now is either go h3 and then knight h2, or maybe even g4 and knight g3, which will give us interesting outpost on f5. We're going to have good active position, good views on the king side. And where's counterplay for black? We can't see it clearly. If we go knight f5, or maybe even g5, and wherever the knight goes, followed by h4, h5, or maybe even, you see, h4 right away, trying to trap the bishop. Knight takes g4 is not going to help. Black is going to lose a piece. So you see, you created some play. You completely controlling the center, your central outpost on e4. if black takes, that does not give them any play. On knight c5, we still go h3. And on bishop e6, we're going to go knight h4 and knight f5. And on bishop h5, we're going to go, in this position, we may go g4 and knight h4 anyway. Actually, in this position, maybe e4 pawn hangs. So we have to be a little careful in this position. If d takes e, we just played knight f1. If d takes e, and knight to c5, we have to think a little bit about defending this pawn. Well, here is one option. We can go here, knight to e3, and now with threatening bishop on g4. If bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and knight takes e4, then we have knight f5 move, which will, I believe, give us a clear advantage. That's just another option. Black couldn't take on e4 with the other knight because of the b4 move. And if this knight takes, then after knight f5, e4 knight hangs, black must retreat, and now white has several ways to get an advantage. I like bishop g5 move, which creates threat of bishop takes f6, but even if we did knight takes d6, queen takes d6, and queen takes e5, we will have clear advantage here because two bishops are much stronger than two knights in this position. So I just briefly outlined the plan that white may have. What are the general ideas when you play King's Indian? What are you aiming for? Because very rarely you're going to get confrontation of the pieces in early stage of the game, and King's Indian probably almost never you get it. So you have to know that plan that you pre-designed here will work if you play it correctly. Now here is one position, d5, and after castling, black will never go c5. For example, they castle, we go knight d2, and now they go b6. Now this is interesting. Continue. We still go e4, bishop b7, you still go rook e1, but on de you have to remember to play knight g5 and not d takes e, because knight takes e4 may be dangerous. Actually, even here, knight g5 move, but then knight d6. So remember, after you cannot allow knight takes e4, because on knight takes e4 we're gonna lose a pawn. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and bishop takes e4. So we cannot allow this. So remember, and I explained this before, it's a similar trick here. So we go e4, and when they take, we go knight to g5. And now we have no problems to taking back on e4 with a g5 knight. So we just simply can take on e4 next move, because e4 pawn is pinned. So this will give you a good idea what we can do with what you can do when you know few critical points, few very typical shots, and general plan in variations we just looked.